The morning sun filtered through the gauzy curtains of Carol Richardson's living room, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor where Emma sat motionless with her wooden blocks. The 3-year-old girl, with her distinctive golden curls and emerald eyes that had once sparkled with childish joy, now stared blankly at the tower she'd constructed minutes earlier. Her small hands were poised in mid-motion, as if frozen by an invisible force that had paralyzed not just her body, but her entire spirit. It had been 18 months since the accident, 18 months of impenetrable silence that had transformed a vibrant, laughing child into this hollow shell of a person. Michael Richardson stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the hallway light. He was a man who had aged 10 years in the span of 18 months. His dark hair, once meticulously groomed, now showed streaks of gray at the temples. His eyes, which his wife Sarah had always said held the warmth of summer, were now clouded with the weight of unprocessed grief and overwhelming helplessness. He watched his daughter with the intensity of a man searching for any sign of life, any flicker of recognition that the little girl he knew was still somewhere inside that small, silent body. The accident had happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah had been picking Emma up from something she'd done hundreds of times before. The weather had been perfect, sunny, clear, the kind of spring day that made people believe in new beginnings. But a drunk driver running a red light had shattered that belief forever. Sarah had died instantly. Emma, trapped in her car seat, had been rushed to the hospital with multiple injuries. She'd recovered physically, though the scars remained. Thin white lines on her left arm, a permanent dent above her left temple. But the emotional and psychological trauma had burrowed deeper than any physical wound could penetrate. The first months after the accident had been a blur of hospital visits, intensive care units, and desperate prayers whispered in sterile corridors. Michael had barely slept, hovering over his daughter's hospital bed, willing her to recover, pleading with doctors for reassurance. Emma had regained consciousness after 4 days of terrifying uncertainty. She'd opened her eyes, looked directly at her father, and then nothing. She'd simply looked away, her eyes unfocused, her expression blank. The doctors had said it was shock, that it was normal, that she would improve with time and therapy. But time had only deepened the silence. Michael had taken a leave of absence from his job as an architectural engineer. His company had initially offered compassion and flexibility, but as months dragged on with no improvement, he'd watched colleagues' patience wear thin. His brother-in-law had suggested he return to work, that Emma needed him to move on, a phrase that had cut Michael like a knife. Move on from what? From losing his wife, from watching his daughter suffer, from the constant, suffocating guilt that he hadn't been there, that he couldn't fix what was broken, that he couldn't bring back the woman he'd loved or the daughter he thought he knew. Carol, Michael's mother and Emma's grandmother, had become the steady anchor in their fractured family. She'd opened her Portland home without hesitation, creating a calm, nurturing environment designed specifically for Emma's recovery. Carol had researched trauma, attended support groups for parents of traumatized children, and tried to create a sanctuary where Emma might feel safe enough to heal. She decorated Emma's room with soft colors, hung paintings of friendly animals, and filled the shelves with books and toys. Everything was designed to be gentle, safe, and welcoming. Yet Emma remained locked in her private world of silence. The parade of professionals had begun almost immediately. Dr., a child psychologist specializing in trauma and grief, had been the first. She'd come twice a week, sitting with Emma, speaking in soft, encouraging tones, trying to coax words out of a girl who seemed determined never to speak again. Doctor had been kind and patient, but even she had eventually admitted that Emma's mutism appeared to be selective and severe, a defense mechanism so powerful that conventional therapeutic techniques seemed to bounce off an invisible wall. Then came Dr. Foster, a pediatric psychiatrist who'd prescribed medications designed to ease anxiety and depression. He'd explained that Emma's silence might be a symptom of stress disorder, that the medication might unlock her ability to communicate. Michael had given Emma the small pink pills each morning, hoping desperately that this time, this doctor, this intervention would be the one that worked. For 2 weeks, he'd held his breath, waiting for his daughter to speak. She'd remained silent. A speech and language pathologist named Mrs. Helen Torres had joined the team next. She'd worked with Emma using picture boards, sign language, and music therapy. Emma had shown mild interest in the singing. Occasionally, Carol had caught her humming along to a simple melody, but she'd never attempted to speak, never written words, never indicated through any conventional means that she understood or wanted to communicate. Family therapy sessions had revealed nothing except Michael's profound guilt and Carol's quiet but relentless determination. A neurologist had run tests to ensure there was no physical damage to Emma's speech centers. Everything had come back normal. Emma's silence, the experts had concluded, was psychological, not physiological. Michael had spiraled into depression himself. He'd stopped calling friends, stopped attending family gatherings, stopped pretending that everything would be okay. He'd become a fixture in this house, watching his daughter, waiting for something that might never come. At night, alone in the guest room that had become his bedroom, he would weep, silent tears that matched his daughter's silent existence. He wondered if he'd failed both his wife and his daughter, if some fundamental inadequacy in him had somehow caused this tragedy. Carol would find him sometimes, standing at Emma's doorway, just watching. She'd place a gentle hand on his shoulder and say nothing. There were no words adequate to the enormity of their grief. Emma's world had contracted to the size of this living room, these blocks, this silence. She ate mechanically when food was placed in front of her. She slept fitfully at night, sometimes waking with silent screams that broke everyone's hearts. She allowed Carol to bathe and dress her without protest, but without any sign of recognition or comfort either. She existed in a state of gray emptiness, neither fully present nor fully absent, suspended in a liminal space where time seemed to have stopped on that terrible Tuesday afternoon. Michael often wondered if his daughter was even in there anymore, if some essential part of Emma had died with her mother. He'd read about selective mutism, about trauma responses, about the remarkable resilience of children, but none of it seemed to apply to his daughter. Emma wasn't resilient. Emma wasn't recovering. Emma was fading, day by day, into something beyond his reach. As he stood in the doorway watching her knock down her tower of blocks, Michael made a silent prayer to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. He prayed for a miracle, for some intervention, for anything that might bring his daughter back from the dark place she'd retreated into. He had no idea that, in just a few days, that prayer would be answered in the most unexpected and extraordinary way imaginable. Officer James had been a Portland Police Department officer for nearly 12 years, but nothing in his career had quite prepared him for the role he'd taken on 6 months ago. The community outreach program that had seemed like a temporary assignment had evolved into something far more meaningful, a mission that gave purpose to his work beyond the typical law enforcement duties. James was 42 years old, with a calm demeanor and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to hold both authority and compassion. His partner, Duke, a magnificent German shepherd with a coat of rich chocolate brown and a noble bearing, was far more famous in the community than James himself. Duke hadn't started his life as a therapy dog. 6 years earlier, the police department had recruited him as a K-9 unit member with high expectations. He'd been trained rigorously for patrol work, drug detection, and suspect apprehension. All the indicators suggested he'd become an exceptional working dog. But during his first year of service, something became apparent. Duke was too gentle. He was too empathetic. During training scenarios that required aggressive responses, Duke would hesitate. When he tracked suspects, he'd alert quietly rather than with the intimidating barking other dogs displayed. During a particularly telling incident, Duke had encountered a frightened homeless man hiding in an alley and had simply sat beside him, offering comfort rather than confrontation. His handlers had considered it a liability. James, who'd been assigned to Duke early in his police career, had seen it as something different, something extraordinary. "He's wasted in patrol," James had told his commanding officer, Captain Martinez, about a year into Duke's service. "He's not cut out for aggressive work, but that doesn't make him a failure. It makes him special." Captain Martinez had been skeptical. The police department had invested significant resources in Duke's training. A dog that couldn't perform traditional K9 functions seemed like a waste, but James had persisted, driven by something he couldn't quite articulate, an intuition that Duke possessed gifts that hadn't yet been discovered. It was during a community event that James had witnessed Duke's true calling. A young boy, maybe 7 years old, had been cowering behind his mother at a police station open house. The child had been visibly traumatized, terrified of authority figures and strangers. When Duke approached gently, the boy's entire demeanor had changed. The dog had simply sat nearby, not demanding interaction, not forcing anything, just offering his presence. Within minutes, the boy had relaxed. Within an hour, he was petting Duke and asking questions about the police department. James had approached his captain that same day with a proposal. Let Duke participate in animal-assisted therapy programs. Let him work with traumatized children, with victims of abuse, with individuals struggling with PTSD. Captain Martinez, moved by James's conviction and seeing the positive community relations potential, had agreed to a 6-month trial. The results had been remarkable. Within weeks, stories began emerging of children who'd opened up to Duke, of victims who'd found comfort in his presence, of families whose lives had been touched by the gentle shepherd. The community responded with overwhelming support. Requests flooded in for Duke to visit schools, hospitals, therapy centers, and private homes. The police department had officially expanded the program, and James had become Duke's full-time handler and partner in this new mission. But on this particular October morning, as James drove toward the Richardson home, he had no idea that today would be unlike any other day in his professional history. He was simply following his monthly schedule, visiting a community referral that Carol Richardson had submitted through the department's website. The form had indicated a family dealing with trauma, a child who might benefit from animal-assisted therapy. James received dozens of such requests. He approached each one with dedication and compassion, but he'd learned not to have unrealistic expectations. Duke sat in the passenger seat of the police cruiser, his head alert, his ears perked forward with interest as they turned onto Maple Street. The dog seemed to sense something significant was about to happen, though of course that was probably James's imagination. Duke had always been an intuitive creature, highly attuned to human emotion and energy. James had sometimes joked that Duke could read minds, though the reality was probably that the dog simply possessed an extraordinary capacity for empathy. The Richardson home was a charming 1970s ranch-style house with well-maintained landscaping and autumn flowers still blooming in the flower beds. It was the kind of neighborhood where people knew their neighbors, where children played in yards, where life supposedly unfolded in peaceful, predictable patterns. James pulled into the driveway, reaching down to gently stroke Duke's head. "Come on, buddy," he said. "Let's go help another family." James had developed a routine over the past 6 months. He always called ahead to confirm the visit, always explained Duke's background and the nature of the program, always set realistic expectations with families. But he'd learned that the best outcomes happen when people relaxed and allowed Duke to simply be himself, a loving, intuitive companion who seemed to understand suffering on a cellular level. Carol answered the door almost immediately, as if she'd been watching for them. She was a woman in her late 60s, with silver hair, kind eyes, and an expression that conveyed both hope and cautious skepticism. She'd experienced enough disappointment with Emma's condition that she wasn't expecting miracles. James recognized that look. He'd seen it countless times in families struggling with trauma. "Officer, thank you so much for coming," Carol said warmly, stepping aside to allow them into the home. "This is Duke." "This is Duke," James confirmed, leading the gentle dog inside. "He's happy to meet Emma and your family." The interior of the home was exactly what James would have expected, comfortable, well-decorated, with photographs on the walls showing happier times. He could see images of a beautiful woman who bore a striking resemblance to Carol, presumably Emma's mother. There were photos of Emma as a toddler, laughing with uninhibited joy. Current photos showed a different Emma, a girl whose eyes had lost their light. Michael emerged from the kitchen, and James immediately recognized the signs of a man carrying an impossible burden. The exhaustion, the worry lines, the way his shoulders slumped slightly, all of it spoke of someone who'd been fighting a battle for which there seemed to be no victory. "Thank you for coming," Michael said, extending his hand for a shake that was firm but weary. "Of course," James replied. "I'm glad to be here. Where's Emma?" Carol gestured toward the living room. "She's in there. Fair warning, she's nonverbal. She hasn't spoken since the accident that took her mother. We've tried everything and—" Carol's voice trailed off, unable to articulate the magnitude of their struggle. James nodded, understanding far more than the brief words conveyed. He'd worked with many nonverbal children. Sometimes their silence came from physical disability. Sometimes it came from emotional trauma so profound that the psyche simply shut down communication as a protective mechanism. "Duke will just be himself," James said gently. "No pressure. Sometimes these things take time, or sometimes they don't work at all, but Duke has a gift for meeting people where they are, emotionally speaking." As they walked toward the living room, James felt Duke shift beside him. The dog's entire demeanor had changed. His focus had intensified. His energy had centered. James had seen this before, that inexplicable moment when Duke seemed to sense exactly where he was needed most. It was one of the reasons James believed Duke possessed something beyond normal canine instinct, something almost spiritual in nature. Little Emma sat in the corner, surrounded by wooden blocks, looking exactly like the photographs but somehow more fragile, more lost. She didn't look up as they entered. She didn't acknowledge their presence. She simply continued her mechanical tower building, her small hands moving with deliberate precision. But Duke knew. Somehow in that moment, the gentle shepherd understood that he'd encountered something he could help heal. And James, standing in that living room, had the distinct sense that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The living room fell silent as Duke entered, a silence so profound it seemed to have weight and texture. Officer James released the leash, allowing Duke to move freely, trusting in the dog's instincts and training. What happened next would later be discussed in psychology journals, debated by animal behaviorists, and attributed by some to miracle, by others to coincidence, but by James to something he'd always believed existed between humans and animals, a connection that transcended language and logic. Duke didn't bound forward enthusiastically as he typically did in new environments. Instead, he moved with deliberate slowness, his powerful frame seeming to glide across the hardwood floor. His tail, usually held high and wagging, moved in a gentle, almost meditative rhythm. His brown eyes remained fixed on the small girl in the corner, and his entire being seemed to radiate a focused intention that was almost palpable to everyone in the room. Emma didn't move. Her small hands continued their mechanical manipulation of the wooden blocks, building the tower higher, her eyes remaining fixed on the structure rather than on the visitor entering her space. To anyone observing, it might have appeared that she hadn't noticed Duke at all, that she was completely absorbed in her task and oblivious to the changes in her environment. But Carol, who'd spent 18 months studying every subtle shift in her granddaughter's behavior, noticed something: a fractional tensing of Emma's shoulders, a minute pause in her block placement rhythm, the quickest flutter of her eyes in Duke's direction before she resumed her work. The dog approached slowly, each step deliberate and controlled. James stood motionless, watching, understanding that this was a sacred moment that required complete non-interference. Michael had stepped slightly forward, as if preparing to intervene if necessary, but James raised a subtle hand, a silent communication that said, "Let this unfold naturally." Duke continued his approach until he was approximately 3 feet from Emma. The dog then sat, his massive frame settling onto the hardwood floor with a soft sound. He didn't extend his paw. He didn't whine or attempt to initiate contact. He simply sat, his body angled slightly toward the girl, his eyes soft and infinitely patient, communicating through presence rather than action. For the first time in 18 months, Emma lifted her eyes from her blocks. Her emerald gaze, which had been so vacant and unfocused for so long, suddenly sharpened. Her eyes locked onto Duke's eyes, and in that moment something remarkable occurred. A recognition, a connection, a meeting of two wounded souls that understood something of each other's pain without needing explanation. Carol felt tears beginning to form. Michael's hand rose to his chest, his breathing suddenly shallow. James remained perfectly still, recognizing the magnitude of what was occurring. This wasn't simply a dog and a child making eye contact. This was something deeper, a moment of genuine connection, of authentic presence, of two beings truly seeing each other across the chasm that had separated Emma from the world for nearly 2 years. Emma's right hand trembled slightly as she lifted it from the blocks. The movement was tentative, uncertain, as if her arm was moving against tremendous resistance. Carol held her breath, afraid that any sound, any movement, any disturbance might shatter this fragile moment. Michael's eyes filled with tears as he watched his daughter perform an action she hadn't attempted with another living creature in 18 months. She reached toward another being with intention and desire for connection. Duke remained perfectly motionless, his body language completely non-threatening, his entire essence communicating safety and acceptance. His tail continued its gentle motion, a subtle acknowledgement that he understood the significance of Emma's reaching. The dog's eyes never wavered from Emma's face, and there was something almost spiritual in that gaze, an unconditional acceptance, a complete absence of judgment, a pure and simple offering of companionship. Emma's small fingers made contact with Duke's fur, and the moment that happened, Carol emitted a small gasp that she immediately tried to suppress. Michael turned away for a moment, overwhelmed with emotion. James felt his own throat tighten with the recognition of what he was witnessing. This was what he and Duke worked toward. These rare, precious moments when a traumatized individual allowed themselves to be vulnerable enough to touch another being, to risk connection after experiencing connection as catastrophic loss. The texture of Duke's coat seemed to fascinate Emma. Her small hand moved slowly across the thick fur, exploring its density, its warmth, its reality. The dog adjusted his position slightly, allowing her better access, turning his body incrementally so she could pet his chest. Emma's breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, began to deepen. Her face, which had been a mask of emotional absence for so long, showed the first signs of genuine expression. Her eyebrows relaxed, her mouth softened, and the tiniest suggestion of something that might have been peace crossed her small features. For several minutes, neither the girl nor the dog moved beyond these gentle, exploratory touches. Emma stroked Duke's fur with increasing confidence, and Duke responded with absolute stillness and acceptance. It was as if the entire universe had contracted to encompass only these two beings, the traumatized child and the gentle dog, each offering the other exactly what they most needed in that moment. Carol realized she was trembling, her emotions having accumulated over 18 months of watching her granddaughter suffer, 18 months of helplessness, 18 months of wondering if the bright, laughing Emma she'd known was truly gone forever. Now, in this moment, she watched as her granddaughter's hand moved with deliberate, intentional strokes across Duke's back, and she saw something flicker in Emma's eyes: engagement, presence, life. Michael had turned back to face the scene, unable to look away. He'd thought he'd prepared himself for disappointment, for the likelihood that Emma would never recover, that this was simply how his life would be forever, watching his daughter exist in a state of emotional absence. But now, seeing her touching another being, seeing the subtle shifts in her facial expression, seeing the return of engagement in her eyes, something shifted in his own chest. Hope, which he'd thought was permanently extinguished, rekindled itself like a small flame that refused to be entirely snuffed out. James observed the interaction with the practiced eye of someone who'd witnessed many similar moments, but even with his experience, there was something extraordinary happening here. Duke's response to Emma seemed calibrated to her exact emotional frequency. The dog seemed to understand, with a certainty that rational explanation, exactly how gentle to be, exactly how present to remain without overwhelming, exactly how to communicate safety through his complete and total acceptance. Emma continued stroking Duke's fur, and James noticed something he'd seen happen before, but never without profound significance. The girl's lip trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sensation of safe human-animal contact after a prolonged period of trauma and isolation. It was as if Emma's nervous system was beginning to process that not all touch meant danger, that not all connection led to loss, that safety and companionship could still exist in this world. Carol reached out and gently squeezed Michael's shoulder. No words were necessary. They both understood that they were witnessing something transformative, something that medical science might struggle to explain, but that their hearts recognized immediately as genuine healing beginning to occur. Duke remained perfectly present, his brown eyes maintaining gentle contact with Emma's face, his body offering steady, reassuring warmth, his presence communicating in a language that transcended speech. "I see you. You are not alone. I am here. You are safe." And in that moment, the seeds of Emma's return to the world were being planted. The living room had become a sacred space, a sanctuary where time seemed to move differently, where the normal rules of physics and psychology appeared to have been temporarily suspended. Emma continued stroking Duke's soft fur, her small hand moving with increasing confidence across the dog's broad chest. Her breathing had synchronized with Duke's steady, rhythmic inhalations and exhalations, creating an almost meditative rhythm between the child and the animal. Minutes had passed, 3, maybe 4, though to those watching, it felt both instantaneous and eternal. Carol stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her hand still covering her mouth. She'd witnessed many small moments over the past 18 months, tiny increments of potential that had always resulted in nothing. But this felt different. The energy in the room was palpably different. It was as if a door that had been locked for over a year was beginning to crack open, just slightly, just enough to allow the faintest light to penetrate the darkness. Michael remained completely still beside Officer James, afraid that any movement, any sound, any disturbance might break this fragile connection. His eyes had fixed on his daughter's face, studying every minuscule expression for signs of life, for indications that somewhere within that traumatized little girl, his Emma was beginning to return. Officer James stood with a serene calm that came from experience. He'd witnessed perhaps 24 moments similar to this over the past 6 months working with Duke in the animal-assisted therapy program. Yet each one felt unique. Each one held its own profound significance. He understood that what was occurring in this living room transcended typical therapeutic intervention. This was something more, an alignment of need, compassion, timing, and an animal's inexplicable ability to meet trauma with unconditional acceptance. Duke's tail had increased its gentle rhythm slightly, a subtle acknowledgement that he was receiving Emma's touch and responding to her presence. The dog's eyes had softened further, becoming almost liquid with kindness. His entire massive body was communicating a single message across species barriers, across the chasm of language and trauma. "I see you. I accept you. You are safe with me." Emma's hand paused on Duke's chest, just above the dog's heart. For a moment, she seemed to be listening, feeling the rhythmic beat of the animal's life force beneath the soft fur. Carol noticed it, this moment of stillness within motion, this pause that suggested something was shifting internally within her granddaughter. The girl's emerald eyes had widened slightly, as if she was experiencing something revelatory, something that was penetrating past all the psychological barriers that 18 months of grief and trauma had constructed. James held his breath. This was the moment. He'd experienced it before, that instant when something shifted in a traumatized individual's neurological processing. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible to the untrained eye, but to someone who'd been trained to recognize it, it was unmistakable. Duke felt it too. The dog's body language shifted incrementally, his already gentle demeanor becoming even more tender, as if he was sensing that something profound was about to occur. Emma's mouth opened slightly. No sound emerged, but the physical act of opening her mouth, of preparing the apparatus of speech after 18 months of complete silence, was monumental. Carol's breath caught. Michael's hand reached out instinctively as if to steady himself against an invisible force. The girl's small chin quivered. Her eyes remained fixed on Duke's, and James realized with astonishing clarity that Emma wasn't looking at Duke. She was looking through the dog into something deeper, something beyond, something that had been trapped inside her for so long that she might not have believed it still existed. A small sound emerged from Emma's throat, not yet words, not yet language, but the sound of the human voice after 18 months of absolute silence. It was barely more than a whisper, barely louder than the sound of wind through leaves, but it was undeniably, unmistakably a vocal utterance. Carol made a small sound herself, a gasp, a whimper, a prayer crystallized into a single breath. Michael took a step forward, unable to restrain himself any longer. His eyes had filled completely with tears that now streamed uncontrollably down his weathered face. Officer James placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, a silent communication. "Wait, let this unfold." Emma's lips moved again, forming shapes that suggested intentionality, that suggested the formulation of actual words rather than random vocalizations. The girl's hand tightened slightly on Duke's fur, as if the dog's presence was the only thing anchoring her to this moment, the only thing giving her the courage to attempt what she hadn't dared try in over a year. And then the words came, fragmentary, trembling, barely audible but undeniably, unmistakably present. "Good dog." The three words seemed to shatter the silence of 18 months. Emma had spoken. The little girl who hadn't uttered a single word since the accident that killed her mother had just spoken 2 words, "good dog," in a voice that was thin and reedy and absolutely miraculous. Carol cried out, a sound of anguish and joy so intermingled that it was impossible to distinguish one from the other. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Michael made a sound that was almost inhuman, a mixture of sob and laugh and prayer, the vocalization of a man whose worst nightmare had suddenly transformed into hope. Duke responded with gentle wisdom that seemed beyond canine comprehension. The dog's entire body relaxed, his tail wagging with increased vigor, his brown eyes reflecting an understanding that his role in this moment was significant and sacred. The dog tilted his head with perfect timing, a gesture that could only be described as tenderness, as if Duke was offering Emma permission to continue, encouragement to keep going. Emma repeated the words, slightly louder this time with incrementally more confidence. "Good dog." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears after so long, unfamiliar, rusty, like an instrument that hadn't been played in years suddenly producing sound again. But the words came more easily the second time, as if the neurological pathways were beginning to remember their function, as if the trauma that had locked her vocal apparatus was beginning to release its grip. Officer James felt his own eyes filling with tears. In all his years of police work, in all his interactions with Duke in this new therapeutic role, he'd never experienced anything quite like this moment. This wasn't just a breakthrough. This was a resurrection. This was a little girl clawing her way back from the edge of an abyss, pulled back by the unconditional love and acceptance of a dog who seemed to understand that sometimes healing required nothing more than presence and patience. Michael took another step forward, drawn toward his daughter like a man emerging from years of darkness toward light. His hands were shaking. His breath was coming in irregular gasps. He wanted to rush forward to embrace his daughter, to vocalize the overwhelming emotion flooding through him. But some deep instinct told him that this moment belonged to Emma and Duke, that this connection they'd forged was sacred and delicate and needed to be honored by those watching. Emma looked up at her father, really looked at him, not through the haze of trauma and detachment, but with actual recognition and awareness. Her emerald eyes, which had been vacant for so long, now held flickers of the girl she'd been before the accident, fragments of the child who'd laughed and played and lived fully in the world. "Good dog," she said again, and this time it was a complete statement, a declaration, a claim that she was returning, that she was choosing connection over isolation, that she was choosing to re-enter the world of language and human connection through the bridge that Duke had created for her. Carol moved forward, unable to restrain herself any longer. She knelt beside her granddaughter, tears streaming down her face, and wrapped her arms around the child she'd feared was lost forever. Emma didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into her grandmother's embrace, and over Carol's shoulder she reached out and touched Duke's head one more time. "Good dog," she whispered into the sanctuary of her grandmother's love, and every person in that living room understood that they were witnessing a miracle, not because it explanation, but because it was exactly what they'd all been desperately hoping for, prayed for, believed might be impossible. The 18 months of silence had finally, miraculously, been broken. The dam of silence that had held back Emma's voice for 18 months began to crumble. What had started as two fragile words, "good dog," quickly evolved into something far more expansive, far more beautiful, far more transformative than anyone in that living room could have anticipated. The breakthrough had opened a floodgate, and Emma, having finally discovered that her voice still existed, that speech was still possible, that communication could happen without catastrophe following, began to reclaim the language that trauma had stolen from her. "Duke," Emma said, testing the word on her lips, hearing how her own name, or rather Duke's name, sounded after months of silence. The syllables were tentative, still carrying the rust of disuse, but they were undeniably words, undeniably intentional communication. Her small face transformed as she spoke, expression flowing across her features like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Duke's name. Officer James recognized this moment, the instant when a traumatized individual's neurological pathways, having reopened after forced closure, began functioning again with increasing fluidity. He'd read about it in psychological literature, but experiencing it in real time was profoundly moving. The human brain, given the right conditions, given the right catalyst, could access capabilities it had shut down as a protective mechanism. Emma's brain was remembering how to form words, how to construct meaning, how to communicate her interior world. "That's right," Officer James said gently, his voice steady and encouraging. "This is Duke. He's a police dog." Emma's eyes widened at this information. Police dog. A new concept, a new category of understanding, a new piece of external reality that she was consciously integrating into her awareness. Her hand continued to stroke Duke's fur, and the physical sensation seemed to anchor her, to provide security as she ventured into the territory of language. "Police," Emma repeated, struggling slightly with the word's pronunciation but persisting nonetheless. "Duke, police." Michael felt his knees nearly buckle beneath him. His daughter was asking questions. His daughter was engaging with the external world. His daughter was communicating not just words, but intention, curiosity, the fundamental human drive to understand one's environment. He moved forward slowly, kneeling beside Emma, his hands trembling so violently he had to clasp them together to maintain control. "Yes, sweetheart," Michael said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Duke is a police dog. He helps people." The word "sweetheart" seemed to register something in Emma. She turned to look at her father directly, and for the first time in 18 months, Her eyes held recognition beyond simple visual acknowledgement. They held emotional connection, the understanding that this was someone who loved her, someone who was important to her, someone from her life before the accident. Her lower lip trembled, and Michael saw the exact moment when his daughter began to process the loss that had been locked away in her psyche. "Mommy," Emma asked, her voice small and fragile, "where's Mommy?" The question hung in the air like a sword suspended above everyone's hearts. Carol made a small sound of anguish. Michael's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away from his daughter. This was a crucial moment, the moment when Emma was beginning to re-engage with memory, with emotional context, with the awareness of what she'd lost. "Mommy's in heaven, sweetheart," Michael said carefully, the words that he and his therapist had practiced countless times finally being delivered to the one person who most needed to hear them. "She was in an accident. She went to heaven, but she loves you very much." Emma's small face crumpled. Tears began to flow from her emerald eyes, not the dissociated, mechanical tears that sometimes appeared before, but genuine tears of grief, of processing, of emotional engagement with reality. She leaned against her father, and Michael gathered her into his arms, holding her as she cried, held her as she grieved, held her as she reconnected with the loss that trauma had temporarily insulated her from feeling. Duke responded to Emma's distress with immediate sensitivity. The dog shifted his position, pressing his warm body gently against both Emma and Michael, offering comfort through his physical presence. The German Shepherd seemed to understand instinctively that this moment required his steadying presence, that his job now was to help Emma navigate the grief that was beginning to flow through her. "Duke's here," Emma said through her tears, her hand reaching up to stroke the dog's head even as she sobbed. "Duke helps." "Yes," Michael whispered. "Duke helps, and I'm here too. Grandma's here. We're all here with you." Carol had moved closer, forming a circle of protection and love around Emma. She was crying too, months of held tension, of desperate hope, of terrified uncertainty finally releasing itself. She placed her hand gently on Emma's back, completing the circle of family surrounding this traumatized child who was finally, bravely, beginning to heal. For the next hour, something extraordinary continued to unfold. With Duke's presence as her anchor, with her family surrounding her with love, Emma began to speak in fragments, in short sentences, in questions about her world. She asked about her toys. She asked why she couldn't remember things. She asked if Daddy was sad. She asked what happened to Mommy's car. She asked if she could see Duke again tomorrow. Each question was a brick being laid in the pathway back to normalcy, back to language, back to engagement with life. Michael answered each one honestly, age-appropriately, with patience and love. Carol periodically left the room to compose herself, overwhelmed by the emotional magnitude of her granddaughter's return to language and consciousness. Officer James observed from a respectful distance, understanding that his role had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer needed as an interventionist. His presence was now simply witness to a family's healing. Duke, however, remained central, constantly available, constantly responsive, providing through his patient, unconditional presence the emotional safety that allowed Emma to continue her journey back from the abyss. "Can Duke stay?" Emma asked at one point, her voice gaining strength and confidence with each utterance. "Can Duke stay with me?" Michael and Carol exchanged a look, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. This child had just broken 18 months of silence. This child had taken the first tentative steps back toward life. If Duke's presence facilitated that healing, then Duke's presence was worth any effort to accommodate. "I think we can arrange that," Officer James said gently. "Let me talk to my supervisor. Maybe Duke can visit regularly. Would you like that, Emma?" Emma's response was immediate and emphatic. She nodded vigorously, her arms wrapping around Duke's neck. The dog tolerated the embrace with gentle stillness, his presence communicating absolute acceptance and unconditional love. As evening approached and the intensity of Emma's emotional breakthrough began to settle into exhaustion, Michael held his daughter while she slept against his chest, Duke curled up beside them on the couch. Carol sat nearby, her hand resting on Emma's foot, unable to look away from the child who had begun her journey back from the darkness. Officer James stood in the doorway, observing this scene of healing and family connection. He'd witnessed the power of animal-assisted therapy many times, but this moment, this child who'd been silent for 18 months now sleeping peacefully, surrounded by love and a dog's unconditional presence, this was the reason he'd pursued this work. The floodgates hadn't just opened. They had torn away completely, releasing the love, the grief, the humanity that Emma had locked away as a survival mechanism. And in its place, emerging like spring flowers after a long winter, was the possibility of healing, of return, of life rekindling itself where it had seemed irretrievably lost. News travels at the speed of human connection, and in the age of social media and instantaneous communication, a story as extraordinary as Emma's breakthrough spread like wildfire through Portland, Oregon, and beyond. What began as a casual conversation between Carol and her neighbor, Mrs., over the garden fence on a Tuesday afternoon, evolved within hours into something far larger than anyone could have anticipated, a narrative that would capture the hearts of thousands and fundamentally alter the trajectory of several lives. Mrs. had been genuinely moved by Carol's account of Emma's miraculous recovery. She'd known about Emma's silence, had seen the worry etched into Carol's face over the past 18 months, and had often wondered how a family bore such an impossible burden. When Carol, unable to contain her joy and relief, shared the incredible story of the police dog visit and Emma's first words, Mrs. had immediately shared it with her daughter, a journalist named Rachel who worked for the local Portland news station. Rachel had been skeptical initially. As a news reporter for 7 years, she'd learned to view dramatic stories with cautious professional distance. But something about this account, a 3-year-old girl who hadn't spoken in 18 months suddenly finding her voice through a police dog, resonated deeply with her. She called Carol directly, conducted an initial interview, and within hours understood that this wasn't merely a heartwarming local interest story. This was a human interest narrative that spoke to something universal about trauma, healing, resilience, and the extraordinary capacity of animals to reach into human suffering and offer solace. Within 3 days, a film crew arrived at Carol's Portland home. Michael, initially apprehensive about exposing his daughter's trauma to public scrutiny, ultimately decided that sharing their story might help other families struggling with similar challenges. If Emma's breakthrough could inspire hope in other parents of traumatized children, if it could illuminate new therapeutic pathways, if it could change even one family's trajectory from despair to hope, then the intrusion into their privacy seemed worthwhile. The initial local news segment aired on Friday evening. It was beautifully produced, showing Emma interacting with Duke, her small voice speaking with increasing confidence, her father's tear-stained face as he watched his daughter reclaim her voice. The segment featured Officer James explaining the animal-assisted therapy program, Duke sitting regally beside him, the dog's intelligent eyes conveying the sensitivity and intelligence that had captured Emma's traumatized psyche. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the segment airing locally, it had been shared on social media platforms thousands of times. Within a day, regional news outlets had picked up the story. Within 2 days, national media was requesting interviews. By the end of the week, Emma's story had appeared on morning talk shows, had been featured in newspaper articles, had generated trending hashtags on social media platforms. Emma and Duke Police Dogs Heal, Trauma Healing Miracle Recovery. The overwhelming majority of the response was positive. People were moved to tears by Emma's journey, inspired by the human capacity for resilience, touched by Duke's role in her recovery. But the story's reach extended far beyond mere entertainment or emotional gratification. It began to change systems, to alter perceptions, to create possibilities where none had existed before. Families with nonverbal children began contacting the Portland Police Department in unprecedented numbers. Parents who'd exhausted conventional therapeutic options saw Emma's story and allowed themselves to believe that alternative approaches, particularly animal-assisted interventions, might offer hope. Therapists and psychologists who dismissed animal therapy as supplementary began reconsidering its potential as a primary treatment modality for certain trauma presentations. Michael received hundreds of emails from people sharing their own stories of loss, trauma, and recovery. He read each one, responding when he could, connecting with a community of grieving individuals who'd found their own paths through darkness. He was invited to speak at conferences, to appear on podcasts, to contribute to academic discussions about animal-assisted therapy and childhood trauma. What had been a private family tragedy was becoming a public narrative that might help reshape approaches to mental health treatment. Officer James became an unexpected spokesperson for animal-assisted therapy initiatives. His supervisor, recognizing the extraordinary public relations opportunity, approved expanded funding for the K-9 Animal Therapy Program. James received requests to speak at veterinary schools, to present at psychology conferences, to advise other police departments on establishing similar programs. Duke, the gentle German shepherd who'd been considered unsuitable for traditional police work, became something of a minor celebrity, recognized on walks around Portland, featured in local publications, celebrated as an ambassador for healing. The police department received hundreds of applications from people wanting to become involved with animal-assisted therapy work. What had been a small, experimental program 6 months earlier was suddenly positioned to expand significantly. Captain Martinez approved funding for 3 additional dog handler teams, recognizing that Emma's story had illuminated a gap in mental health services that animals could uniquely address. But perhaps the most profound impact was on Carol and Michael personally. Michael, who'd spent 18 months drowning in private grief, discovered that sharing his story publicly offered unexpected healing. The responses from other grieving individuals validated his experience, normalized his trauma responses, connected him to a community of people who understood the particular devastation of losing a spouse and watching your child suffer. He joined an online support group for widowed parents, began attending in-person grief counseling sessions, and slowly began reconstructing a sense of life having meaning and purpose beyond the tragedy that had shattered it. Carol became an advocate for animal-assisted therapy in her community. She worked with the Portland Police Department to develop educational programs about trauma-informed care. She gave talks at schools about helping children process grief and loss. She became a visible reminder that even in the depths of despair, unexpected miracles could occur, and that sometimes those miracles came on 4 paws and infinite compassion. The media attention also attracted the attention of researchers and academic institutions. University of Oregon Psychology Department approached the Richardson family about conducting a case study on Emma's recovery. Temple, the renowned animal behavior expert, reached out to Officer James about potential collaborations in animal-assisted therapy research. What had begun as a routine police department community visit was generating scientific interest and scholarly inquiry. But amid all the external attention and impact, what remained most important was the quiet, daily reality of Emma's continued healing. She attended preschool now, made friends, laughed with the unself-conscious joy of a recovering child. Officer James and Duke visited regularly, not as celebrities or therapy interventionists, but as beloved family friends. Emma's vocabulary expanded exponentially. Her emotional processing deepened. She was learning to carry her mother's memory while still engaging fully with life. One evening, as Michael tucked Emma into bed, she asked a question that had been forming over weeks of recovery. "Daddy, why did Duke help me talk?" Michael paused, considering how to answer a question that encompassed profound psychological, emotional, and spiritual mystery. "I think," he said carefully, "because Duke understood that you were hurting. And sometimes when we're hurting so much we can't talk about it, the love from someone, or in this case, someone furry, can help us find our voice again." Emma smiled at this explanation, her emerald eyes reflecting the wisdom that comes from surviving something that almost destroyed her. "Duke's magic," she concluded simply. And perhaps, in ways that science couldn't yet fully explain, she was right. Duke's presence had worked magic, not through supernatural intervention, but through the transformative power of unconditional love meeting profound trauma and refusing to accept silence as the permanent condition of a child's life. 6 months after Duke's transformative visit to Carol's home, Emma Richardson stood at the entrance of Riverside Preschool, her small hand clasped firmly in her father's, her emerald eyes bright with anticipation rather than fear. She wore a lavender backpack decorated with embroidered flowers, and her golden curls were tied back with a matching ribbon. To anyone observing her, she appeared to be a typical 4-year-old girl starting preschool, excited, slightly nervous, ready to explore this new chapter of her life. But to Michael, standing beside her, Emma's presence at this school represented something far more profound than a routine childhood milestone. It represented resurrection. It represented hope made manifest. It represented the return of a daughter he'd feared was lost forever. The transformation over these past 6 months had been gradual yet unmistakable. Emma's vocabulary had expanded exponentially. What had begun with 2 hesitant words had evolved into full sentences, complex thoughts, and the vibrant verbal expression typical of her age. But more than language had returned. Emma's emotional range had expanded as well. She laughed now, genuine, unself-conscious laughter that filled rooms with joy. She cried when she was sad, expressed anger when frustrated, displayed affection openly and without reservation. The emotional flatness that had characterized her for 18 months had completely dissolved, replaced by the full spectrum of human feeling that had been locked away by trauma. Michael had his own profound transformation during these 6 months. He'd returned to work part-time, finding that having a purpose beyond his daughter's survival helped restore a sense of normalcy and identity. His colleagues had welcomed him back with genuine compassion, and he discovered that many of them had followed Emma's story through media coverage. Some had shared their own stories of loss and recovery, creating unexpected connections that normalized his experience and connected him to a community of grieving individuals who'd found ways to integrate loss into their lives without allowing it to define their entire existence. The grief support group he joined had become central to his healing. Every Thursday evening, he sat in a circle with 8 other widowed parents and shared his journey, the early months of despair, the breakthrough with Duke, the slow reconstruction of his life and identity. He'd learned that grief wasn't something to get over, but rather something to integrate, to carry, to transform into compassion and wisdom. He was beginning to understand that Sarah's death, while devastating and unfair and unnecessary, had also fundamentally altered his capacity for empathy, for presence, for recognizing the extraordinary in ordinary moments. "Emma's excited about her snack-sharing day," Michael said to her teacher, Mrs. Susan Martinez, as he walked his daughter into the colorful classroom. "She wants to bring the chocolate chip cookies her grandmother baked." Emma nodded enthusiastically, her verbal confidence now so evident that it was difficult to imagine the 18 months of complete silence that had preceded it. "Miss Martinez, can I tell about my dog friend Duke?" Mrs. Martinez, who'd been informed about Emma's history through careful conversations with Michael and the school's counselor, smiled warmly. "Absolutely, Emma. I think your classmates would love to hear about Duke." Michael watched as his daughter separated from him without distress, moving toward her classroom with a combination of cautious excitement and social awareness that indicated genuine healing. The separation anxiety that had characterized Emma's early months of recovery had gradually diminished. She still sometimes asked if her father would be there to pick her up, but these questions came from normal developmental curiosity rather than from the desperate fear that had driven them before. Carol, meanwhile, had discovered an unexpected new chapter in her own life. Her work with the police department's animal-assisted therapy program had blossomed into something more formal. She'd completed certification in animal therapy coordination and was now serving as a volunteer coordinator for the expanded program. 3 times a week, she went to the police station to help organize visits, to work with volunteer handlers and their dogs, to connect families seeking help with available resources. It was through this work that Carol met David, a retired veterinarian who'd volunteered to provide medical oversight for the therapy dogs. David had lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier and understood the particular loneliness that came from loss. He was quiet, kind, and possessed a deep understanding of animals and their capacity for healing. Over the course of several months of coordinating schedules and planning programs, a friendship had developed between them, first professional, then gradually more personal. On a sunny afternoon in early spring, 6 months after Emma's breakthrough, David had asked Carol to dinner. She'd accepted hesitantly, feeling both disloyal to the memory of her late husband and hopeful that life might hold unexpected joys even after profound loss. The dinner had been followed by others, and Carol found herself rediscovering companionship, laughter, and the possibility of romance in a stage of life she'd assumed was behind her. Michael, watching his mother's gradual transformation from grief-stricken caretaker to engaged, hopeful woman, felt profound gratitude. If Emma's healing had restored his daughter's voice, then perhaps witnessing Emma's recovery had restored his mother's will to fully live again. Officer James and Duke had become permanent fixtures in the Richardson family's life. They visited Emma at preschool, participated in her birthday party, and maintained the regular Thursday evening visits that had become sacred family time. But James's life had transformed as well. The expanded animal-assisted therapy program had created opportunities for advancement within the police department. He'd been promoted to lieutenant and now oversaw the entire K-9 unit, including both traditional police dog operations and the animal-assisted therapy division. More unexpectedly, James had met Dr. Torres, a clinical psychologist who worked with the police department on animal-assisted therapy protocols. Had approached James after a conference presentation he'd given about Duke and Emma's case, and they'd begun collaborating on research documenting the efficacy of animal-assisted interventions for traumatized children. What had begun as professional collaboration had gradually evolved into something more personal. James found himself looking forward to their research meetings not merely for the intellectual stimulation, but for the opportunity to be near, to see her passion for helping traumatized individuals, to recognize in her a kindred spirit who understood the profound ways that animals could bridge the gap between human suffering and healing. Emma's prognosis was excellent. Psychological evaluations conducted 6 months post-breakthrough showed remarkable recovery, while Dr., her psychologist, noted that Emma would likely always carry some residual effects of the trauma, occasional nightmares, sensitivity to loud noises that resembled the car accident. Her overall psychological functioning had returned to age-appropriate levels. She was making friends at preschool, engaging in imaginative play, showing creativity and humor and all the markers of emotional health. Most remarkably, Emma had become something of a minor celebrity in the Portland community. Local businesses had begun featuring her story in their advertising. The Riverside Preschool had incorporated Emma's experience into their trauma-informed care training for staff. Children's hospitals had requested permission to use her story in their pediatric psychology programs. But what mattered most to Emma was far simpler. She could talk to her daddy. She could hug her grandmother. She could play with Duke. She could eat chocolate chip cookies and attend preschool and laugh at silly jokes and ask endless questions about how the world worked. She could experience the ordinary joys and challenges of childhood without the suffocating weight of trauma locking her into silence. One evening, as Michael read Emma a bedtime story, she paused him mid-sentence. "Daddy, I'm glad I found my voice again." Michael felt tears spring to his eyes. "Me too, sweetheart, me too." "Duke helped me," Emma continued, her logic simple and profound. "Duke showed me it was okay to talk again." "Yes," Michael agreed, stroking her golden hair. "Duke did that, but you did the brave part. You're the one who decided to speak. You're the one who chose to come back to us." Emma considered this, then asked the question that had haunted Michael for 6 months. "Will I ever see Mommy again?" "Different kind of seeing," Michael said gently. "Mommy's not here, but she's in your heart. She's in your memories. She's in the way you laugh, which is just like her. And whenever you think about her in a way, you're seeing her." Emma seemed satisfied with this explanation. She closed her eyes, her small hand gripping her stuffed animal, a toy dog that resembled Duke, a gift Officer James had brought her months earlier. As she drifted toward sleep, Michael sat beside her, marveling at the resilience of the human spirit, at the extraordinary capacity of children to survive and recover from trauma, at the miraculous intervention of an unexpected ally, a German shepherd with a heart larger than his enormous body could contain. The new life had begun. Not a life without loss. The loss of Emma's mother would always be part of their story, but a life where loss and healing coexisted, where trauma had been transformed into wisdom, where a family had learned to survive and ultimately to thrive again. 5 years had passed since that October morning when Officer James and Duke had walked through the door of Carol Richardson's Portland home. 5 years since Emma had spoken those first transformative words, "Good dog." 5 years of healing, growth, transformation, and the rippling consequences of one child's courage to reclaim her voice. Now, on a crisp autumn evening that mirrored the season of her breakthrough, 8-year-old Emma stood on a stage at the Portland Police Department's annual gala, holding a microphone with confidence and poise that seemed impossible for a child who'd been silent for so long. Emma had grown into a beautiful, articulate young girl with her mother's laugh, her father's thoughtful nature, and a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. Her golden curls had darkened slightly with age, framing a face that bore the subtle imprint of the trauma she'd survived and overcome. Her emerald eyes, once vacant with the weight of grief, now sparkled with intelligence, compassion, and a quiet strength that came from having faced darkness and chosen to return to the light. The auditorium was filled with over 300 people, police officers in dress uniforms, community leaders, media representatives, volunteers from the Animal-Assisted Therapy Program, and families whose lives had been touched by Duke and Officer James's work. Large screens displayed photographs from the past 5 years. Emma at her preschool graduation, speaking her first words to a therapist, meeting other children helped by Duke, playing with her newfound friend Oliver, a boy who'd also struggled with selective mutism until Duke's presence had opened his world to language. Michael sat in the front row, his arm around his wife of 3 years, Jennifer, a woman he'd met at his grief support group who'd also lost her first spouse and understood the particular pain of rebuilding a life after catastrophic loss. Jennifer had become not merely Michael's partner, but Emma's beloved stepmother, a woman who'd helped Emma process her complex feelings about her father's new relationship and the expansion of their family. Emma had ultimately embraced Jennifer, recognizing that her father's happiness didn't diminish her mother's memory, but rather created space for both grief and joy to coexist. Carol sat beside them, David's arm encircling her waist. They'd been married 2 years earlier in an intimate ceremony held in the Portland Police Department's community center, with Duke serving as an unofficial best man, his presence a blessing upon their union. Carol had discovered that love and companionship could flourish even after loss, and she'd become a living testament to the possibility of multiple chapters in a human life. Officer James stood to the side of the stage, now Lieutenant James, overseeing a K-9 unit that had expanded to include 12 animal-assisted therapy teams. Beside him stood Dr. Torres, his wife of 2 years, and the director of research for the animal-assisted therapy program. They'd married in a beautiful ceremony where Duke had served as official ring-bearer, and they were now expecting their first child, a daughter they planned to name Sarah, in honor of Emma's mother and the losses that had ultimately connected these two individuals across time and grief. Duke, now 11 years old, sat regally on the stage beside Emma. The dog's muzzle had grayed, his movements slightly slower than in his younger days, but his eyes remained brilliant with intelligence and compassion. He'd spent the past 5 years helping over 200 traumatized children find their voices, their agency, their capacity to reconnect with life after experiencing loss or violence or abuse. His story had been featured in veterinary journals, psychological publications, and mainstream media outlets. He'd become something approaching legendary in Portland, the dog who'd helped a silent girl speak, and in doing so, had changed the trajectory of an entire family's life and transformed approaches to mental health intervention. Emma stepped to the microphone, and the auditorium fell completely silent. She was comfortable in this space, having spoken publicly dozens of times over the past 5 years. But this particular speech was different. This was the culmination of her journey from silence to voice, a moment where she would speak to her own experience with the authority of someone who'd lived it. 5 years ago, Emma began, her voice clear and strong and carrying the confidence of a child who'd learned that her words mattered. I couldn't talk. I didn't know how to tell anyone about the hurt inside me. I was so scared that if I opened my mouth, the sadness would be too big, the pain would be too much, and I would disappear completely. She paused, allowing the weight of that statement to settle into the audience. Michael felt Jennifer's hand squeeze his shoulder gently. Then Duke came to my house, Emma continued. And Duke didn't ask me to talk, he just sat with me, he let me pet him, he was there. And somehow his being there made me brave enough to try words again. Emma looked directly at Duke, and the dog's tail wagged gently, as if acknowledging her gratitude across the bridge of years and transformed lives they'd built together. I want to tell you about the other kids I've met, Emma said, and the screens behind her illuminated with photographs of children she'd worked with through her volunteer involvement with the animal-assisted therapy program. This is Oliver. He couldn't talk either. Now he sings in his school choir. This is Maya. She was so scared after what happened to her that she couldn't be around people. Now she's learning to ride horses as part of her therapy. This is James. He didn't believe anyone could understand his sadness about his mother. Now he talks to me about missing her, and we talk about how Duke helps us both remember that we're not alone. The images cycled through. 15 children whose lives had been touched by animal-assisted therapy, whose trauma had been transformed through the patient, unconditional presence of animals and the humans who worked alongside them. My daddy told me something important when I was learning to talk again, Emma said, her voice becoming softer but no less powerful. He said that my mommy is in my heart. She's in my memories. She's in the way I laugh, which is just like her. And I realized that by not talking, by not living, I was letting my mommy's accident take away everything, not just her, but me too. And I didn't want to lose me as well. She paused, her young eyes glistening with tears that she didn't bother to hide. So I talked, and it was scary, and it was hard, but it was also the bravest thing I've ever done, because talking meant feeling everything, the sadness, the anger, the love, all of it. And I realized that feeling everything was better than feeling nothing. Emma looked out at the audience, her gaze sweeping across police officers, families, volunteers, all of them connected by their understanding that healing was possible, that animals possessed gifts that transcended conventional explanation, that sometimes the most profound interventions came through the simplest acts of presence and unconditional acceptance. "I want to tell you what I'm doing now," Emma said. "I'm starting a nonprofit foundation called Duke's Voice. We're going to help bring animal-assisted therapy to more children who are struggling like I was struggling. We're going to help families understand that trauma doesn't have to be permanent, that silence doesn't have to last forever, and that sometimes a dog's love can do what all the medicines and doctors couldn't do. It can help us remember that we're worth saving." Michael wiped tears from his face. Carol reached over and squeezed his hand. Officer James felt his own eyes filling with emotion as he watched this remarkable young girl articulate the journey that had brought all of them to this moment. "I'm 8 years old," Emma concluded, "and I've already learned that my voice matters, that my story matters, that my pain transformed into something that can help other people means that my mommy's accident, as horrible as it was, wasn't completely meaningless. It hurt so much that I stopped talking. But stopping talking made other people pay attention to what silence really means. And now, because of that silence, hundreds of kids are getting help they wouldn't have got otherwise." Emma took a breath, and her final words carried the weight of a truth hard won through suffering and survival. "My mommy is not here to see what I've become, but I think if she could see me, she would be proud. I'm proud of me. I'm proud that I found my voice again. And I'm so grateful for Duke, for my dad, for my grandma, for everyone who helped me believe that I was worth saving, that my voice was worth hearing, and that my life was worth living." The auditorium erupted in applause, a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Emma stepped back from the microphone, and Duke moved to her side, his aging body still graceful, his presence still radiating the unconditional acceptance that had first opened the door to her healing. Michael stood, tears streaming down his face, applauding his daughter, this remarkable young girl who'd climbed out of darkness and transformed her suffering into a beacon of hope for others. Carol stood beside him, David's arm around her, both of them witnessing the full circle of healing and transformation that had begun 5 years earlier on an ordinary October morning. As the applause continued, Emma reached down and hugged Duke, burying her face in the dog's gray-muzzled neck. The dog remained perfectly still, his life's work culminating in this moment. A traumatized child who'd found her voice, her agency, her capacity to help others, and a foundation that would carry forward the healing work for generations to come. The little girl who hadn't spoken in 18 months had become a voice for thousands. The silence that had seemed like an ending had instead become a beginning. And the dog who'd been deemed unsuitable for traditional work had instead been the instrument of transformation, proving that sometimes the greatest power comes not from strength or aggression, but from patience, presence, and the unconditional capacity to love those who've forgotten how to love themselves.